feel like I need a director's sign. Vaheguru Ji da Khalsa, Vaheguru Ji da Fateh. Just to kind of try to make a connection between what Jesse was describing in the Shabad. One other thing that really came to my mind, which hopefully will be something that I can explore in this topic on what I call the pen and the sword in Sikh tradition, is this question that the Shabad raised in my mind about choice. So on the one hand, the Shabad puts us in a position of being, in a state of, kind of asks us to think about the limits of our ability to know the world, to know Akal Purakh, and yet we also know that our gurus were not ascetics who went into the mountains and did nothing and contemplated only. They actually, in spite of recognizing the human limitations of knowing the world, were always building, always creating, always engaging. And my background as an anthropologist, this is what has always, I found very inspiring, both as a Sikh myself, but also as a professional, just to think about the level of creativity and just energy that the gurus put into their communities, in their lives, and the level of engagement that they were always trying to model for us as Sikhs. So there's an interesting paradox that the Shabad puts us in, right? On the one hand, we have to recognize our limitations in being able to fully understand or comprehend and get beyond that desire to do that, the ego that's involved in that desire to want to comprehend something completely. But on the other hand, if we look at the lives of the gurus and we want to really use them as models for our own lives, we have to think about the ways in which we can act in the world, the ways in which we can do things in the world. So, when we had the conference in September, I was really interested in this question of the tradition of peace or peaceful coexistence within the Sikh tradition. And in the spirit of Guru Gobind Singh Ji's birthday, I thought that I would think about it in relationship to Guru Gobind Singh Ji himself. So that's why I thought of this title, The Pen and the Sword, where Guruji, we know Guruji as being kind of an icon of action, of being, forceful in defending his principles, in defending his community against people who would, kind of create what I describe up here as an existential threat to the community. So Guru Gobind Singh Ji faced a period where the Sikh community was, experiencing an existential threat and had to act, had to make decisions. So, he was really dealing with both this existential imperative and then what I would think of, and what I believe he thought about as ethical imperatives. How to act, how to respond when you are facing an existential threat. And everyone understands this idea, right? I mean, just existential is a fancy way of saying a threat to one's being, a threat to one's right to live in the world or exist in the world. And how do you face that threat? Sometimes it can be directly through violence, and sometimes existential threats are not necessarily violent, but they're still a threat to one's identity or one's being in the world. So I think, Guruji did this. He was a really interesting person because he explored many avenues. He started his life by asking his father, Guru Tegh Bahadur Ji, to give up his life, the ultimate kind of non-violent response to the existential threat that not only Sikhs but Hindus were facing at that time because of the repressive attitudes of the Mughal regime. So he started with this kind of moment of pushing his father, being at least if we are to believe the Sakhis that we read about, of asking his father to give up his own life for the sake of the community, for the sake of the right of people in the community to exist. And then as he gets older, obviously this is history everyone knows, he creates a brotherhood, the Khalsa, which then also becomes a force for challenging the existential threat in a much larger and more kind of directly martial way. And so, but at the end of his life, he then, ends his life basically with the writing of the Zafarnama, which is again moving. So in his life, he's moving back and forth between these choices he has on how to face the kind of threat to himself and the community from the Mughal regime. And in the end, by putting down the sword, picking up the pen, he then goes back to this identity as statesman, as someone who's now wants to face this threat by kind of engaging Aurangzeb in a conversation about the justness, about the ethics around what Aurangzeb is doing. So I'm not an expert on the history, but I just think this is, for me, given where Sikhs are today, and I really want us to actually very quickly come to the Sikh community today and the problems that the Sikh community is facing today in this country after 9/11 in relationship to things like the racial profiling and discrimination and bullying that children are facing. How this is, in a way, a kind of our existential threat. And how should we face this existential threat? And I think that our gurus offer us a number of wonderful, kind of tools that we have a toolbox. And so for me, when I thought of this title, I really wanted us to remember that there are many tools in the Sikh toolbox in relationship to being a good Sikh as an individual, but thinking about our responsibility to our community and thinking about our responsibility to Sarbat da Bhala, to the whole human community, and how do we balance those things. So anyway, I basically wanted us to think about Sikh history and different periods of Sikh history through what I call these kind of, Sikh identity, scope, and purpose. So when I thought about, how should I talk about this, I really wanted us to go back to Sikh history because ultimately, when we make choices today, we always, to some extent, make choices in reference to how people how our grandparents or our great-grandparents or our gurus, what choices did they make and what do we learn from that? But we're also responding to our lives in the current moment. So we're kind of looking back, looking forward, looking in the present when we're making these decisions. So I thought it would be useful to think about how the Sikh community has kind of evolved over various phases of Sikh history. And so I thought of these words for us to think about how we as a community identify who we are, how we think about ourselves as a community. What is the scope of our community? What is the purpose of our community? Those are the two questions. And I think those things will lead us to an interesting set of answers, or at least ideas about how to deal with the problems the Sikh community faces today. So I have here these terms which may not be complete, but they're the terms that that mean something to me when I think about the progress of the Sikh community. When I think about Guru Nanak Dev Ji in particular, and many of the gurus, this is the term that comes to my mind. When I think about Guru Nanak Dev Ji and the community that he lived in, I think of Sangat, And for me, Sangat, in my mind, evokes, is a very kind of intimate community, a community in which people were really focused on building relationships and building new types of relationships. Because, again, the gurus, they weren't satisfied with the old social roles, right? Guru Nanak Dev Ji, from the time he was a young boy, was defying the old social norms. He rejected the Janot. He rejected, the ways that his parents had lived. He rejected those ways. But he still believed in building a community. He didn't want to live outside of the world, outside of the community. So, initially, much of the early part of the Sikh community was built around this concept of Sangat. And I guess I'll stop here and ask you, what does Sangat mean to you? What is a Sangat?
Sangat is the society, Sikh society.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And it also means in the sense of sacredness that we come here on a Sunday and we, I came here after almost 3 weeks today. And I felt so amazingly good listening to the Kirtan that I felt like coming here in this Gurdwara is something very, very special. It's a sacred place in San Jose. We can't do the same thing at home. I have Harmandir Sahib program every day, but it is not the same thing. Mm-hmm. Because you see physical people, you see here the Kirtan is being done here, live. And Sangat has that dimension also, that you see physically people who are of your own community and they're trying in their own way, trying to preserve. But this issue of preserving the Sikh identity is a very broad one.
Yeah, and that's something that we'll explore.
We also need to look at how others have handled similar issues.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I agree with you.
That there are many other groups, many other religions, right, that the orthodoxy is not the only way.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm very to see.
I think you did a great job. Just continuing to your discussion regarding Sangat, the thought that comes to the mind to me at least, is Sangat is someone who is trying to connect to the ultimate. We are in the company of people who come to the Gurdwara for a reason, and everybody is trying and finding paths and ways to connect back to the ultimate source. So if you have the people that can meet anywhere in the world, outside the Gurdwara, if they're talking about it and trying to connect, that's also Sangat. If you find even one person to connect, that's Sangat. And then they say ultimate Sangat is even if you don't find nobody else, but you are yourself sitting and communicating with him, that's the Sangat between him and the Creator. So all the outside channels finally lead to the inside channel. And when you're in that channel, you are in harmony, you are in bliss, you are in peace, with His blessing, of course. We can only request and beg for the company of that particular Sangat, those souls who are ahead of us, who are either reached home or who are reaching home, to their understanding, their knowledge, their information, so that we can all tweak our thought process. Because the variables on the earth are too many. It's like a chess table, right? There's so many different moving pieces. But to find one particular path with His blessing, we request and beg, God help us, show us, so that we may all, reach wherever you want us to reach. Because we don't know. All we know is we need to reach someplace, but we don't know exactly how and where. We only request, hey, you know your job better than us. Kindly bless everybody. That's all.
Right. Yeah.
Sorry.
Yeah.
A line from Qurbani comes to mind. A line from Qurbani comes to mind. Ek Sikh do satsang. So like the Guru says, Ek Sikh do satsang. So like-minded individuals and a community of like-minded individuals. And then yes, in Sikhi everything is from outwards to inwards, everything, whatever it might be, whether it's Sangat or Gurdwara or Amrit or the articles of it, whatever, it's all internal eventually.
Right.
So that's really what Sangat is, like-minded individuals gathered for a purpose.
Right. And I mean, the thing that because I teach at Santa Clara, it's a Jesuit university, they have this concept of the whole person, and I think of that when I think of Sangat, where the Sangat is simultaneously about social life. It's simultaneously social but spiritual. It's kind of this interesting space in which you're bridging these elements of who you are as a human being, your physical needs, your social needs, as well as your spiritual needs. And so, and the Guru's...
That's very true, Sangeeta. Very true. Gurdwara is also a social place.
Right.
Yeah.
That's what Uncle Ji was saying, that he felt good about coming here. You can do the same part sitting at home, but when you come in a community of people, it's a different feeling. And so, and I think, again, you know, I always think of the Gurus as these really smart social scientists, as a bias of my own, because they really understood human psychology. They understood the nature of the way institutions shaped who we were as individuals, and the potential we had, or the limitations that institutions could both open up potential and also limit us. And I think Gurus, especially Guru Nanak Dev Ji, was all about offering more people greater opportunity to fulfill their potential by, you know, removing these tendencies towards caste, by talking about women in the way that he talked about women, by talking about the poor. You know, I mean, he really felt that there was a kind of need to restructure the society in order to give more people the opportunity to achieve their potential. And for me, Sangat is really about this sense of a kind of, it's a really truly democratic kind of space. It should be, and it's a space in which there's a lot of interconnectedness, but also personal autonomy in a good way, in the sense that, again, appealing to that concept of achieving your full potential. So, you know, and I think Sangha does this in part because it is this, originally was this very intimate face-to-face community. As we kind of progress in Sikh history, you know, by the time Guru Gobind Singh Ji creates the Khalsa, we start to think about the Sikh community. It is physically becoming a bigger community, right? The number of people who start to see themselves as Sikhs is growing and growing. And then we get introduced to this concept of Panth. And I don't think they're the same thing. And so I think it's very important for us, as we think about who we are in America, how we want to be Sikhs in America, how we should respond to other people about who we are. We should have a really good and nuanced understanding of all these concepts which we've used to understand who we are. But they're not all the same. So Panth, you know, for me, indicates a kind of much more of a kind of political community. The Sangat felt more like a kind of, you know, spiritual, social, you know, kind of much more, almost like a extended family, community.
There's
And
also a difference between a local intimate thing versus a transcending thing for the whole community.
right, exactly. And the Panth, you know, and again, I mean, Guru Gobind Singh Ji, you know, again, I'm not an expert in Sikh history, but as looking back on what he was doing from a social science perspective, he was very astute in understanding that the time was right to create an identity that went beyond just a one local community, that could bind people, you know, together on principles, exactly. And in the same way that Panth in many respects reminds me of kind of patriotism a little bit, because, you know, we can feel connected to a larger group of people who we may not even ever meet, but we feel that connection through these symbols. And symbols are very, very important in every tradition, in every human community. Symbols are the way in which people are bound together, because symbols represent principles. Symbols are a way for us to talk about principles in a very kind of, in a simple way, but we can convey a lot of depth of meaning through symbols. Like you, Jesse, you spoke about the nishan. You know, a nishan has such a range of meanings within it, but that one word conveys that range of meanings, which then binds people together. And for Guruji, this was important at the spiritual level, but very important at the existential level, right? If he didn't bring these people together, this community would have been wiped out by the Mughals, or would have been at the very least extremely weakened by the Mughals. So, you have this period where you have Panth, which is kind of a political and spiritual identity, but I think it's different from the period after the Gurus, when you have the...
Literally means
Hanji.
a way, or it's more than that actually. Way as well as it has religious connotation.
Yeah.
Religious way, I guess.
Right. That's interesting. Does the word mean a way, like a path? That's interesting, yeah.
It sort of means religious path.
Yeah.
You know what?
But it's used in the sense of an identity for a whole community.
Yeah.
And I think she's very astute in giving it this dimension of being not just a spiritual community, but maybe political is the wrong word, but I can't think of anything else.
Engagement.
Yeah. Well, institution, you can think institutional,
right.
yeah.
Almost like, and yes, there are...
It's a structure that enabled people to work together, in other
goes
words.
beyond Sangha.
Right,
and
right.
It has,
Yeah.
in its operation, it has ramifications and way beyond Sangha.
Right.
It has a purpose almost. It has its identity.
Right, and that's the question is, what was the purpose, then, and what is the purpose now? And that's really what I want us to get to. So, I mean, if we think of Panth as something larger and also maybe more complex in the sense that it's an added layer to what the Sangats were doing at a local level, the Panth was trying to kind of broaden that focus. And maybe this comes out of Guru Gobind Singh Ji's own, life, because one of the things I've written about in another...
It was there even before
Anju.
I mean, in a way,
Yeah.
every group, there was a evolution
Right.
of the Sikh Sangat and the Guru's teaching.
You're right, yeah. I'm just using the Khalsa as a moment where the Panth really kind of culminates. Yeah.
Khalsa first terminology came into after that.
Right.
It was informal.
But you're right, many other gurus were already building up to this. I mean, Guru Arjan Dev Ji was really key in the sense that by creating certain cities that became associated with Sikhs, Amritsar and other cities that he was really involved, or towns that he was involved in building, what he was doing was building up to this point. But what I want us to think about is what is the difference between Panth and Raj? Because what we have in the post-Guru Gobind Singh Ji period is the rise of the missile system, which eventually develops into the rise of Maharaja Ranjit Singh, right? So it's an evolution from a more kind of, as Virji was saying, missiles we tend to think of as more democratic. They were kind of like, equals within a larger region. And then you have, of course, Maharaja Ranjit Singh, who is able to consolidate all of this in Raj. But I don't think Panth is exactly the same as Raj. And I'll give you an analogy that I think will help you understand the difference. If you think of in the United States, when we think of the United States, we think of the concept of democracy, right? So democracy is a set of principles, but often, if you ask anybody around the world, when they think of the word democracy, they often think of it as linked to specifically the United States, the nation, the political entity. But democracy is not just a political entity, right? Does that make sense? I mean, you have the United States, which is a physical place. It's a land on which people have created certain types of political and social and economic institutions, which are organized around, to some extent, this principle of democracy. So even though we often see the U.S. as the kind of birthplace of democracy, it is not synonymous with democracy. In other words, democracy is not bound to the United States.
It's more expansive.
It's more expansive. So the Panth, Raj, on the other hand, like nation, is always it's a social unit that is bound to a particular territory. And that's the difference. So Guru Gobind... Hanji?
Raj is government.
It is government, but it also implies kingdom, doesn't it? Sovereignty. Hanji. And sovereignty is always linked to territory, or at least for a long time. That you can't have sovereignty without a specific territory.
The history of religions before these kind of democratic government came along, religions were also united. They had their own sovereignty.
That's true.
That the Gurus or the Sikhs were obeying the Muslim, the Mughal Raj only to a certain extent. Right? So there is at that time it was intertwined, religion and the government. And that has been
Right. Well,
we have been losing that, right?
Hanji, I agree, but I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing. And I'm not sure that the gurus themselves were interested in not that kind of worldly sovereignty.
Right. If you have funds and you have sangat and you have the spirit of existentialist crisis, you have to have force. That's what Guru Gobind Singh, he had such a short life, 42 years, and it's amazing that the amount of spiritual and military thinking that he could create in such a limited time.
I agree with you, but again, that's what we have to ask ourselves. Is sovereignty really a goal? Was it a goal for the gurus?
No, it was not.
They never conquered any territory.
Right. They did build things, and they built things from a different. So in that sense, maybe they achieved. Maybe Guru Arjan Dev Ji had some.
Defense, it was certainly if they were not aggressive.
Right.
Defenses and
That's right.
A sovereign state where the spirit of the truth and the ability prevails.
It was not bound by.
Well, we're not sure though. I would say that maybe if Guru Gobind Singh Ji had lived, we don't know what choices he would have made.
Well, we know
but
what choices he made, Sangeeta.
Anji.
He never. What are some of the nishans, as you say, of sovereignty? They have their coins, they have their flags, they have their territory that they conquered. They have their name on it.
Right.
None of that.
Right.
He conquered to free the people.
Right.
So it was the sovereignty of spirit that he sought after, not of a. It wasn't bound by.
Right. And I mean, that's what the Zafarnama also suggests. Right.
And he was
No, but
not interested in that.
He was not.
Right, but I'm gonna kind of stick to the gurus right now because there is a lot of very interesting literature on Banda Bahadur. But I think that for our purposes, let's we don't know. I mean, Banda Bahadur. Clearly, Guru Gobind Singh Ji had a relationship with him, and he went and made choices, but many of those choices were made after Guruji was gone. And I mean, that history is done, and I just want us to kind of go back and think about it, so that when we again, I really hope that it will have some relevance to the choices we make today, in relationship to how we respond to people who are threatening us, or people who don't understand us. And just what it means to a kind of evolving sense of Sikh identity. Hanji.
I think back on the Raj, how do you interpret when it says Raj Karega Khalsa? In what context do you really read that part?
Yeah.
Regarding present culture, society, because part of it is really education. Because if people are educated, then there will not be discrimination. They would like and love to know more about Sikhism. So what Guru Nanak Dev Ji was really doing was he was educating people, even Hindu caste and Muslims, to become more of a human being, not be stuck in your roles, which are not right, ethically, morally.
Yeah.
So, to answer your question, I think the education, if people understand the value, what they stand for as mankind, I think they will get a much, much better respect and regard for us.
Right.
And Raj Khalsa, I don't know, maybe you could explain.
Wouldn't Raj Khalsa an ambition and desire and a purpose rather than something else?
Yeah.
It's a desire of the nation and community. We wish to have
We're moving the
Yeah.
Self-prevail.
Yeah, truth.
Right.
It doesn't say
Right, right. Yeah. No, but I think this is all very interesting because it's, no, but you're absolutely right, Benji. I mean, you know, it's a very slippery term, right? But the question is that, you know, we have to then decide for ourselves now how we want which our Raj to look like. And I mean, I agree with you that I think that ultimately, if we go back to the principles of Guru Nanak Dev Ji, which was the foundation of all this, Guru Nanak Dev Ji was trying to look way beyond his own community. He was thinking at the level of humankind, but my only point in bringing all this is that I think that there's, you know, we as a community have evolved through history, and because this was the wave of history, it's not just because of us, which sometimes took us more inward looking than looking at this kind of universal kind of idea of mankind, humankind, as opposed to the Sikh community. And I just think it's helpful to remember that, you know, we've gone through these stages, which is not just us, honestly. I mean, if you look at the rise of the concept of nation and the ideas of nation within the Sikh community, this really corresponds with the colonial period. And the British bring this concept of nation, which is a kind of modern sense of identity, to India. And they really encourage many communities, especially Sikhs, who they kind of defined as one of the martial races. You know, the British used to call the Sikhs one of the martial races, because it served their purpose as much as it served our purpose. You know, it served the British.
Did us a disservice because it limited us. It highlighted one aspect of Sikh.
Yeah,
An
yeah.
important aspect, but it's colored it.
Yeah, I mean, you know, and I'll speak to that for just a few minutes, because when my advisor, when I was in graduate school, actually wrote a book about this. His name was Richard Fox, and he wrote a book about Lions of the Punjab. And what he really wrote about was this period of Sikh history when the British were recruiting, how they recruited Sikhs to the army. And you know, they did this wherever they went, the British. They found groups of people and they defined them in ways, and then those people, because of the British dominance, had to kind of find their own identity within that structure. So the British defined the Sikhs and the Marathas and the Gurkhas as these martial races. And in fact, one of the things that my advisor wrote about was how when young men, if they wanted to join the army and if they came from Sikh families and they didn't have the articles of faith, they had to take Amrit and they had to wear a turban and have a full beard in order to join the army. Now this can be both good and bad. It's good at one level, right? They kind of created a uniform and they kind of reinforced some of these markers of the Khalsa, which had kind of been, you know, diluted, or however you want to. There was a whole history of 100 years between the time Guru Gobind Singh Ji made the Khalsa and then the time, 150 years, and the time that the British. But it also served the British purposes. So at one level, what they were doing was kind of reinvigorating this identity that Guru Gobind Singh Ji had given us by kind of saying, look, if you want to join the army and you want to get all of the privileges of joining the army, and it was a good deal for young Sikh men at the time because they got a good job, they got status, you know, they got a role, and they got, as a community, we actually, Hanji, respect Hanji, and we, as a community, we were actually given a place in the kind of colonial structure, which was very important for us as a community. So those are the pluses. Some of the downsides is that by defining us as a martial race, we started to kind of internalize this identity for a while, you know, which is part of our identity. When I say that the pen and the sword, I'm not in any way denigrating the sword, but I'm saying that in this moment in Sikh history, you know, our modern Sikh history, which if you think about the colonial period and the post-colonial period, it has kind of really focused a lot on this kind of notion of the Sikh as a martial person, as one who must always pick up the sword and fight the battles that way. So that's why I'm trying to just quickly go through this, very broad strokes of history. So when you get to this period, after the Raj period, I think more of kind of Maharaja Ranjit Singh. But then when we get to the British colonial period, Sikhs start to see themselves in terms of nationhood. And this gets reinforced even after the colonial period. In the Punjabi Suba.
So nation, how is it different from Panth?
Well, I think it's a more modern sense, again. I mean, I think that...
Just semantics, or is it, are there any...
I think that, if you look at what nation meant to people in the 19th century and 20th century, it was a combination of cultural identity and values, ethnicity, language, and a territorial location. So those things had to correspond. And actually this happened in Europe as well. I mean, Europeans in the 17th century didn't have this strong sense of nationality. It's really in the 18th century when the French and the British...
In Europe, nations came at the end of the religious wars.
Hanji, right. And that's what I'm saying. It was a kind of modern way of understanding identity. And it corresponded with lots of other things that were happening in Europe. But in particular, a nation was a cultural group that shared a language and shared a particular territory. I think in this period, for Sikhs, Punjab as a territory becomes a very important symbol of Sikh identity. And if you think about if you go again, jump back to the Gurus period, while the Gurus obviously were from Punjab, their families were from Punjab, many of our Gurus spent a lot of time outside of Punjab. I mean, Guru Nanak Dev Ji spent most of his life outside of Punjab, traveling.
Guru Gobind Singh never visited?
Right. Well, he did, but Guru Gobind Singh Ji was born in Patna.
Did he never went?
Did he never live in Punjab?
He never visited Amritsar.
Hanji?
Oh yeah.
Anandpur Sahib? But Guru Gobind Singh Ji's life was also what I think of as diasporic within the continent. He never actually, he was born in Patna, he came to Punjab in Anandpur Sahib and of course established the Khalsa Panth, but he was hardly there for a few years, and then he went to fight the battles and ended up dying in Nanded, in Maharashtra. So he
Spent a lot of time in Kota
Right.
outside Punjab.
Hanji, exactly. So I mean, my point is that this focus on territory is a modern focus. It's not as much, the Gurus were not as committed to this kind of territorial identity, which, again, I'm not judging any of these things. I just want us to think about it because I think it has really strong implications for how we understand ourselves and how we should think about how that identity is changing. Anyway, so we have this modern period where nation becomes a metaphor for how Sikhs understand who they are. And I would also add race becomes a metaphor. Maybe not anymore, but the British were really insidious. They used this term race and they used it all wherever they went. They convinced people that you're part of this race and you're part of that race. And our Gurus did not believe in race. Right?
They still rule like that in Britain.
Hanji, they do.
They still rule like that.
Yeah, and again, the British, that was their worldview. They understood the world through this categorization.
It also gave them the hierarchical.
Oh, absolutely.
That was vital.
Right.
To their social fabric.
Right. It justified all of the things that they did. When they murdered people at Jallianwala Bagh, they were able to do that because they really believed in these racial differences. What I think is really important for Sikhs is to get beyond this language of race. And it's not just Sikhs. I mean, everyone uses the language. Right. And many groups use the concept of race, and maybe it has some benefits. It unites people, it makes them loyal to each other, but it has a lot of downsides. And to me, it's very against the fundamental, again, Guru Nanak Dev Ji's message of a kind of universal experience of humankind.
The only race that all these mankind.
हाँ जी हाँ जी मानस की एक जात है हाँ जी
You know, Sangeeta, okay, so I know that you're saying Guru Nanak Dev Ji's concept of mankind. I don't want us to forget that it was equally Guru Gobind Singh's message.
Oh, yes.
Of oneness.
Of course,
Of,
yeah.
Manas ki jaat sab
Right,
example.
right.
And, you know, there is this Shabad, Bang ke Bengali, where in that Shabad he really talks about every geographical area
Right.
within India and outside of India. And then he ends it. Yeah, and
Yeah.
he says that Tere Aagya mein chalant hai.
Yeah.
So from Guru Nanak to Guru Gobind Singh, race had no meaning.
Right. No, and you're absolutely right. I mean, the fact that the 5 initiates of the Khalsa were all from different castes is an indication of that, right? I mean, the Hanji, different, oh, yeah, exactly. So, I mean, Guru Gobind Singh Ji was very self-aware of these divisions, and really caste and race are very similar types of categorizations, right? They, you know, you're born into a caste, you're born into a race, there's nothing you can do to get out of it, or at least theoretically. So you're absolutely right,
It's a label,
yeah.
it's like a stamp on
Right.
it that you
But
carry on
it's
your
a
life.
false label because at least in modern times, there is only a single race.
Yeah.
Then you can't say-
Except it's not practiced. I mean,
Right.
you know, it's a single race except it's the white, you know, the elephant in the room.
Right, right.
Time I was quite arrived.
Right, I mean, and race is, yeah, I mean, but in any case, nation often was used in this concept of kind of a community that shared some sort of biologically shared qualities as well as territory, as well as culture and language. That's how nation was defined in the 19th and 20th centuries. And in many ways, we kind of internalized that, you know. And then, you know, and this kind of continued a little bit through the Punjabi Subha movement and the Khalistani movement, where people were really thinking about in terms of nationhood. And of course, there's a really famous book by a scholar, Cynthia Mahmood, who wrote about the Khalistani movement, and it's a very beautiful and sympathetic discussion of the Khalistani movement, and the name of her book is called Fighting for Faith and Nation. And it's not a coincidence, because we really, Sikhs in the 1980s and 90s really saw themselves as kind of thinking of themselves as a nation or as a nascent nation.
I think it was because once again they felt an existential
Threat, yeah.
of the mainstream community.
Yeah, right.
And they felt everything, including their
Right.
land, was being undermined and
Right.
discriminated against.
Right, right.
The split
Yeah,
first,
yeah.
further split, further
Right,
split,
right.
and then discriminated in terms of the amenities and, and the grants and everything else that was given. So they
Yeah.
wanted to
The
create that.
solution they had to find had to be in terms of the paradigms of the time, which was nations.
Right, exactly. And that's exactly what I'm trying
Because
to
they
say.
couldn't do it sitting in India. There were these pockets, you know, different, mostly in Canada, where they started, you know, generating this
Right.
patriotic
Right.
feelings about nation.
Yeah.
Or the need for a nation.
Right. But I agree with you. And it was an existential threat, both in Punjab and outside of Punjab. But people, different types of existential threats. I think outside of Punjab, people were worried about losing culture because they are now living in a foreign place. And so they could kind of relate to the threat within Punjab.
But here is something that's really interesting to look at, Sangeeta. Not just as a Sikh, but as an individual living in this time and place and in this country. By 2030, they say that there will be, with all the mixed marriages that are inevitable among Sikhs as they are in any other group of people, it's going to be very difficult to tell which. There will be no majority race, and it will be very difficult to identify people as one race or as one. I mean, the children of our children, they are going to be.
Right. Right.
Possible, they'll be more spiritual than us.
No, I'm not talking about spirituality.
Biologically.
Yeah.
Actually, I mean, from the perspective of biology, we're kind of going on a tangent, but it's actually not relevant at all. There is no such thing as these 4 races. I mean, in biological terms, they're just small human populations which marry and intermarry. The difference between us and Africans is there's no difference. I mean, we're actually a subset genetically of the larger African gene pool. But anyway, I don't want to talk about that. But anyway, so we, and then today, what we have today is this increasingly the Sikh identity is associated with a much more transnational experience, right? Because now Sikhs live all over the world. The ability to move back and forth between here and Punjab has made it so easy to move back and forth.
No. I can't get visa for that country.
Hanji? Oh, you can?
I'm honest with you.
Yeah.
I'm going here on Wednesday because I can't get a visa because I don't have the American citizenship certificate.
Okay.
That's a function of radio.
Yeah, that's right. But if you look at the broader community, we really are kind of a diasporic community, and so which then brings us back a little bit to where our gurus were. Yeah, where the gurus were really they weren't interested in just limiting themselves to the borders of Punjab. They made by choice a diasporic move, and so have we. Not to say that we are the gurus, but we find ourselves back in this moment where now it's natural for us to be part of this very multi-ethnic, multicultural milieu, which even the gurus themselves embraced the multi-ethnic, multicultural milieu.
The internet is producing a unique sense of identity.
Absolutely. Yeah, right, absolutely. I talk about that a lot in my classes because
Before at that level.
Anji, yeah. So these are the kind of what I think of as the basis for us understanding where we are. So I'm going to just move forward and just get to my punchline. Finally, I'm sorry. So basically, one of the things that I'm interested in studying is thinking about the Sikh community after 9/11 from a concept of institution building. In other words, I'm a cultural anthropologist, so I'm really interested in how communities respond, how they both preserve identity but adapt to new situations. And that's exactly what we as a community have been doing in this country, right? 9/11 is a kind of very interesting historical watershed moment for us because suddenly we went from kind of relatively obscure obscurity to being the poster child of targets, right? And what I think is, and so one of the things I hopefully will get to, write about eventually is this period that has produced both crisis but a tremendous amount of creativity in the community. Because the crisis has actually generated the creativity, and in the creativity, specifically what I think of the creativity is the rash of institution building that has occurred. So since 9/11, Sikhs have become very, very active in creating all kinds of new institutions. Before 9/11, we were basically focused on our gurdwaras, right? But now there's many Sikh coalitions, Saldaf, there are civil rights institutions, there are cultural institutions, there's United Sikhs, there are Seva institutions, there are political institutions. If you get online and look at the number of blogs that are associated with Sikhs, we may not agree with all of them, but these are expressions of identity and creativity. And they are, all of them, the one thing they share is that they are trying to respond in different ways to our own existential crisis right now, which is that we are perceived as being, we are perceived as terrorists, or we're perceived as violent, or all of these negative things because of this outward look. And so that's really what I'm interested in. And what I've found is that the response overwhelmingly has been, if you think about every time there's been a crisis in the last few years, and you think about how Sikh, particularly those who in the media have responded to these crises, the one message that unites most of them is that we define ourselves as a peaceful and tolerant people. And these terms have been used again and again and again by Sikhs about who we are when we're trying to talk to the community outside. We are increasingly defining ourselves as peaceful and tolerant people. I think this is wonderful. I mean, you know.
Forced us to go back to the basics.
It has, exactly.
And really question
Yeah.
what was thrust on us, which was a part of our identity, because of the circumstantial nature of where we were at that time, that defined us in entirety.
Right.
And that's what we are fighting, and we
Right.
had to fight.
Right. And what we see in this moment is a shift back to the pen, right? I mean, blogging is kind of metaphorically the pen. People are using knowledge, their words, their creativity, whether it's paintings or writing or culture, to convey to the outside world who we are. And this concept of peace is very, very powerful. And I gave a talk at Santa Clara for our department, and I focused on this period, you know, this concept of institution building in the Sikh community. It's amazing the ways in which people are reaching out and trying to educate other people. Whether that will work or not is a whole entirely different question. But as a community, we are defining ourselves increasingly around the sensibility of being peaceful and of being tolerant and of being open to other traditions.
In the last 10 years, since September 11, is it 10 years?
More than that, yeah.
There's also the big thing that Sikhs are recognized as a separate religion. Much more.
You're right.
than we were. That we were so few earlier.
Right.
That we were really gone.
Right.
And that is itself and Sikhs are setting good examples also. Many people know, for example, that a Sikh is a spiritual person more than anything else. I mean, in this country, they don't necessarily associate us with being martial people.
Right, and I think that's because of all of this response to, you know, the kinds of things that we've been facing as a community. But I'll also say that this is not, it doesn't mean that there isn't a diversity of ideas. So that when I was looking at blogs and reading responses, I came across a website where someone actually proposed arming Sikhs, that the only way to protect us is to, teach people how to use guns. And so there are other, now we can laugh, but the point is, but it's coming out of the spirit of self-defense, and preservation. Yeah, and so I'm not gonna judge,
No,
but
it's a very important part of it.
yeah, right. And so there are people who are worried about this concept that we don't want to come across as pacifists, so we can be interested in peaceful coexistence but not being pacifists. And so, that was only one website, and I'm going to see if there are others out there that kind of support that. So even now there's an internal kind of debate going on. And I also think that there's a lot of air between, or space between, what we portray to the outside world and how the dynamics of our internal communities. And I don't have a conclusion on that, but I think it's something that's very important for we as a community to think about. That is there a lot of correspondence between the image that we're trying to portray outside and what we are actually doing within the community?
In the community, we are certainly martial.
With it, yeah.
I think in the process of trying to communicate to the others, I think we communicate to ourselves as well.
Yeah.
So it is reinforcing
Yeah.
these things about
Yeah.
ourselves, especially in the younger part of our community.
Yes, I agree with you, Vichaar. And actually much of this message and much of the institution building is happening among the younger generation who are very educated. And again, this is a certain strata of the Sikh community, but a vocal and powerful strata. They tend to be educated, younger, and many of them tend to be diasporic in the sense that a lot of them, if you look at Sikh studies scholars, many of them are people who maybe came to the United States from England via East Africa, and so they're a couple of generations removed from India, and so they have a more cosmopolitan view of the world anyway. So this may not represent what the entire Sikh community believes or feels, but it's an important trend in our community to think about. And so I'm going to kind of leave you with that. Yeah.
Trend, Sangeeta, that is scary for us. that
1 minute.
in re-establishing their identity, a lot of the younger Sikhs are becoming much more rigid in who they are, and going actually exactly against the core message of Sikhi, of acceptance. So they are creating this hierarchy within the community, and that is a very scary concept. I wonder if, I think you know what I'm talking about.
Yeah.
There's this, and that's a trend that is very recent. And I saw its beginnings in Canada first, and now it's come over here, and it's very strong and it's very prevalent amongst a certain segment of young Sikhs.
I know what you mean, a kind of new, some of the new practices.
Born again type of mentality.
Yeah, right, yeah. Yeah, I think my only response to that, Jesse, is that there's always been a diversity of ways within the Sikh community. As small as we are, there's a tremendous amount of diversity. And, I think that as long as we can maintain institutions, particularly gurdwaras, should remain accepting of that diversity. I mean, I think that the minute you try to stamp it out, it's going to only kind of make it a negative thing. And so I think that, I know what you're saying, and
For example,
Generally speaking,
but I think there's just a diversity.
family,
Yeah.
Sikh, whatever.
These are just pictures from Oak Creek.
It's all.
And if I just wanted to show you these pictures because these are pictures from Oak Creek. And if you look at this one, this is a candlelight vigil after Oak Creek, and they have a sign here that says "Practice Peace" with a young man holding the Nishan Sahib. To me, that was very striking. And maybe this is just an American experience. I don't know. I don't know if this is happening in other parts of the world, but.
Seen any blogs from or responses to the blogs from Indian Sikhs
No.
living in India?
I haven't really focused on what people in India are doing. I'm really interested in North America and in relationship to 9/11 because I think it's in some ways a unique experience. I do know that after Oak Creek there were actually demonstrations in India. And in my talk at Santa Clara, I show pictures of those demonstrations because they're strikingly different from these Sikhs living. Well, there was a demonstration where people were very angry about the fact that this happened in a gurdwara, and there was like they had their kirpans drawn out, and they were marching, and they're angry. And then you flash to the vigils here, and if you look at, I don't know if everyone can see it, but
How political demonstration in that area happened.
right, no, I understand that, and it's context, but it's just really interesting how it's, on the one hand, they are us, right, and we are them, but there's a difference, and these are subtleties that are important for us to think about.
That's a very big
different experience.
Hanji?
That's a big difference from night and day. You're saying,
Right,
say and to be,
right,
it's day and night difference.
you're right,
Like in Japan, remember after the earthquake?
right,
They showed the society as a whole how comfortable peaceful they were. Nobody was looting, nobody was
Right.
doing all that stuff. That's a society showing, look, we are in harmony.
right,
That's what Sikhs, as an example, we all have to set.
right,
Instead of taking out the stuff,
right,
first time,
right,
be peaceful. And when the candle is lit, candle doesn't have to say I'm lit. In the dark. Same thing, if Sikhs are peaceful and they are patient, the world will know by default.
Right.
Nothing to say.
right.
Only people are to say is who may not be.
Yeah, and I agree with you, and I think that's actually a transformation that our community is really going through. It's in part a choice we're making, and in part it's the cards that history has dealt us. But that's okay. I mean, we have to, as long as we are thinking about the choices we're making, that's the important thing, and thinking about them in the context of our history. I mean, for me, that's very important.
Violence is more powerful than a lot of people.
Hanji, absolutely. So that's the existential and ethical imperatives. Thank you so much.
May I make a couple of comments? This is the first time I am a student of my daughter in a classroom setting. So I felt very happy today. I've never attended a class. She would let me go to a class. So I am very happy and proud.
Father of his daughter.
Yeah, he's too nice.
So is he a good student?
I am, me
No.
and my wife, we moved to Pittsburgh in 1971. I've lived there for 42 years. We have built a very beautiful Gurdwara. There's no, the sort of you see in many. And really, we are just coming from Houston, where my son lives in Katy, and they go to a new Gurdwara in Sugarland. That's even much better than our Gurdwara. I tell you why. Because the Sindhis there are very much part of it.
It's lovely.
So I would strongly recommend that we should find out Sindhis who still believe in Guru Nanak and Sikhi and involve them here.
Yeah.
Lot of times we are excluding some of these very important people.
Losing them in the bargain.
And losing. In Pittsburgh, we have not been able to involve them somehow. The Hindu temple is a lot bigger and stronger and all that. They all go there. But when they have a death in the family or a birthday, they come here. Marriage. So I would, this is another thing I want to make sure,
They come, but they are institutionally not here.
well, sort of,
It's one of the
So
okay.
another point I want to make, I'm recently, actually, my nephew went to India and brought this book. It's called Punjab by Raj Mohan Gandhi. He's the grandson of Mahatma Gandhi. It's a beautiful book. And the Sikhs and Maharaja Ranjit Singh and Missals have been given a lot of space in that. And it's very well written. Excellent English. He is a professor of something in University of Illinois, So he has written many books. And I will strongly recommend all of you to get this book, Punjab by Raj Mohan Gandhi. It's published only this year or last year.
Well, since we're making plugs for the book that inspired me to think about this is Nikki Guninder Kaur's book on the birth of the Khalsa. And I would recommend everyone try to read it. It's not easy to read because she's a philosopher, but I think she's really done an amazing job of trying to...
Available on the Amazon.
Yeah.
On Amazon,
Let me
yeah.
tell you how we got to birth of the Khalsa by Nikki Guninder. By Harbans Lal, who lives in Dallas, Once I was visiting him, so he told me to get this book. And since then I must have bought a dozen of them and given to people. It's a very beautiful book, and it gives a Guru Gobind Singh. She basically says Guru Gobind Singh gave birth to Khalsa.
Yeah.
And who gives birth to people? Women. So she is using feminism.
Yeah.
Beautifully written English,
beautiful.
and
That's
she's the
important.
daughter of Harbans Singh, who was who's the original editor of the Sikh encyclopedia, and
Punjabi University? Yeah, he's a professor.
Yeah, he was.
He might be.
yeah, so he's the same guy. So I would strongly
I don't
recommend
think
that.
he's alive anymore.
But there's a lot of good scholarship out there on Sikh studies, so...
Encyclopedia also very good.
So thank you so much.
Thank you, Sangeeta. Really enjoyed it. Very stimulating. Very astute too.
Thank you.
I'll just say, I'll go further regarding Sindhis. Actually, Sindhis have more faith in Sikh religion than what do we have. And if we don't recognize them as Sikhs or call it extended family of Sikhs, it will be a big mistake on us.
We've already made that mistake.
We have made that mistake. They actually, the way they built up the Gurdwara, the way they maintain, the way they have all the functions there is commendable. I've been associated with the Gurdwara, which was totally maintained by Sindhis. All langars were planned by Sindhi. It was in Devlali. Okay, so the teaching of gurus is not restricted to Sikhs only, but on turbans. It is all over.
Sanjay.